Changeworking, moving minds for change that lasts.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Changeworking, a show for practitioners and coaches who help their clients create change. My name is Ruckus, and as always, I'll be in conversation with James Tripp. Today, we're talking about the brain, and specifically the hemispheres of the brain. And no, I don't just mean a simplistic view of creative versus analytic. James gets much deeper into it than that, and I found it really interesting, and I hope you do too. So, here's my conversation with James about the hemispheres of the brain.
Have you read The Master and His Emissary, McGilchrist's massive tome?
Is it okay to say that I wanted to read it and I tried really hard and I was just like, what is this?
I had it for 10 years until the audiobook came out, and I was like, oh, I can do the audiobook now.
Whew.
Right. So I had the book for a decade in hardback, and it's like a brick and a half thick.
Right.
And I'd started trying to read it, and I just couldn't get my head around it. And then it came out on audiobook, and it really legit blew my mind. I told my friend Di, this has blown my mind. This has genuinely changed my life. And she got that. And then she said, I'm sorry, James, I really tried to get into it, but it's actually the only Audible book I've ever returned. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I stuck with the mofo. It wasn't an easy thing, but the thing that blew my mind was when he starts to get into how much the left hemisphere makes shit up and really believes it. And he gave all these examples from stroke victims of stuff, of insane stuff where people just like, no, that's absolutely true, but there's no evidence for it. And I had this epiphany. Almost everything I believe, I have no evidence for. Like even the most strongly, deeply held beliefs, I actually just have no evidence whatsoever that the world actually works that way. And it blew my mind for a time. I thought, I don't know shit about anything. I don't have evidence for most of my most cherished beliefs. So now I'm much more open to things that I previously would have gone, that's nonsense. I'm like, how do I know it's nonsense? I don't know anything. Maybe there's something to it. So I'm kind of much more into, I don't know what you call it, spooky action at a distance. Is that what Einstein?
Yeah, spooky action at a distance, which I love.
Yeah.
Because it sounds so non-scientific.
Yeah.
But it's a beautiful way of phrasing it, yeah.
Yeah.
Just briefly mention that book again.
Yeah, The Master and His Emissary, Ian McGilchrist. The story of The Master and His Emissary is that there was once this wise master that ruled over a land and was known for being, wise and kind and good and all of this kind of thing. And because the wise master was wise, he realized that there were certain things he wasn't so good at. So he got this emissary who would help him out with certain logistical tasks and organizing certain things and this sort of thing. And the emissary started doing a lot of really good work out in the land, but came to see its own work, or his own work, the emissary's own work, as being valuable, and couldn't understand what the master was even doing. And stopped even seeing a function for the master and started to think, I'm the master. And therefore usurped the master and took over the kingdom, and then the kingdom went to ruin. This is an old fable, supposedly, from some indigenous folklore. So McGilchrist uses this to say this is what's happened across history with our hemispheres, that we've actually built a world. The left hemisphere has kind of been successful at certain sorts of things, and therefore it's created more and more of a world that fits its own way of thinking and its own way of being. And that's the world that we have, which therefore feeds back to us to be more left hemispheric in our engagement because the world demands that of us. And then we make a more left hemispheric world. And the left hemisphere doesn't see the value of the right hemisphere. So even the idea that it's the dominant hemisphere and the other hemisphere is the the subdominant hemisphere. And that sort of comes into culture. So the left hemisphere cannot, this is something that McGilchrist says, the left hemisphere is not aware of the world of the right hemisphere, but the right hemisphere is aware of the world of the left hemisphere. But our consciousness tends to be tacked to our left hemisphere. Right? So there's interesting things where, again, with the split brain patients where they have the corpus callosum severed, and this is a last resort case for severe epilepsy. These people, there's examples of somebody choosing like an item of clothing, and then the other hand like takes it and throws it down and gets something else. Like you get this rebellious other hemisphere, but one of them always feels like I.
Yeah.
So there is a sense that the dominant hemisphere is the one that is tied to that sense of I, the I that is the agent, the I that acts in the world, the I that whatever. Whereas the right hemisphere has less ego, less sense of I, and therefore doesn't relate to that kind of consciousness. So it does feel to the people when they've had this done that their left hand is doing things that they are not choosing to do. It's just like, well, no, it's just the other they. It's just your I-ness is tacked to the left hemisphere. So that's the metaphor. So Ian McGilchrist, he's a psychiatrist. Before that, he was a humanities major, and then he got into medicine and psychiatry, and then got into neuroscience. So he's gone back and looked at all the old research materials, and he's come up with this idea. And part of it is neuroscience. It's just reflecting on neuroscientific studies and also lesion studies. But part of it's also he's got a great interest in philosophy and history, and it's kind of merged them together in the Master and His Emissary, and looked at the sort of arc of Western civilization and how left and right hemisphere dominance has ebbed and flowed, and how you can see that manifesting in taste in art, and how people learn about perspective and all of these sorts of things. It's just quite an interesting thing.
You mentioned earlier the hemispheres of the brain.
Oh, yeah.
And I would love to chat about that if you don't mind. Because my first reaction when you started that was like, what is it, that right and left brain thing? In my head, that's some old debunked stuff.
Yeah.
And that's completely different from what you're saying. So I would love some clarity on that, just because I haven't heard this from you.
Okay. So McGilchrist starts out the Master and His Emissary by saying that a lot of the original ideas about left and right hemisphere have been debunked, but that doesn't change the fact that there are significant differences between the left and right hemisphere. So a lot of the problems like he encounters, he says hemispheres, people go, oh, that's all been debunked. It's like, no, I'm not talking about the stuff that's been debunked. I'm talking about something else. So his point is that it isn't the case that the left hemisphere is creative, the right hemisphere is, or whatever, vice versa. But that the hemispheres attend to the world in very different ways. So it's a matter of how they attend and how they organize experience that is quite radically different. So the left hemisphere tends to be much more linear in its approach. So it goes this, then this, then this, then this. It's very ordered. It tends to be sequential. It goes for goals. It does like logic, and it likes things to fit together and to be black and white. So it sees the parts and a sort of linear relationship of parts. The right hemisphere tends to see patterns and wholes. It gets implicit meaning, so it understands things implicitly, whereas the left hemisphere only understands things explicitly. So these are major differences. There are lots of other differences as well. They're both involved in speech. You see, there's this idea that, the left hemisphere does speech and the right hemisphere doesn't. They're both involved in speech and language, but they deal with different aspects of it. So the right hemisphere tends to deal with the tonality and the sort of inflections and all of that side and the musicality of it, whereas the left hemisphere deals with the digital logical words. But the right hemisphere can understand language, and this has been demonstrated in split brain experiments, because you can deliver messages linguistically to the right hemisphere that it will act upon, whilst the left hemisphere has no clue what it's doing. So what they used to do, they would give the right hemisphere instructions. They would say, stand up and walk out of the room. And the person would stand up and walk out of the room. This is with people who had their corpus callosum split. And then the experimenter would say, where are you going? Why are you walking out the room? They go, well, I'm thirsty. I need to go and get a Coke from the Coke machine. They just make up a reason and genuinely believe it's true, really believe it's true. So you've got these kind of different ways of attending and paying attention. And also they tend to kind of fit in, like the idea, the left hemisphere is logical and the right hemisphere is emotional. Not strictly true. The left hemisphere is involved in certain emotions, and the right hemisphere is involved in other emotions. Particularly, you get a lot of left hemisphere activation with anxiety and elation and ecstasy, oddly, So the left hemisphere really wants to control things. People are typically wired. The left hemisphere controls the right side or influences the right side. So people do all this sort of acting and grabbing and this kind of thing with the dominant side. Interesting thing that has been observed, again, with people who have got particular kinds of lesions that sort of free a different level of control from the hemispheres. So there's a similar lesion that can happen on both sides of the brain. When it happens on the left hemisphere, the right hand grabs at things randomly. Just keeps grabbing stuff, like grabbing this, grabbing that, grabbing. If it happens on the other side, the left hand doesn't grab anything. It feels around and explores things. So anyway, it's a huge book, and there's a huge case for how these two different sides do things in very different ways. I think when it comes to change work and that kind of thing, a lot of the time when people get stuck, they get stuck in very left hemisphere dominant patterns, or a lot of the time it's that left hemisphere and its attempt to make sense. And this is why Erickson was always discouraging people from using what he called their conscious mind, which largely maps to that left hemisphere, and use their unconscious mind instead, which is a different way of paying attention. Left hemisphere is very directed, narrow focus. Right hemisphere, big picture. Left hemisphere sees the trees, right hemisphere sees the wood, these sorts of things. There's loads of stuff in the book about the effects that damage to the different sides in same places on the different sides changes how people draw things and stuff like that. So basically, McGilchrist thing is like those two hemispheres do life entirely differently. They see the world entirely differently. They relate to the world entirely differently, and they want to be in balance with each other. When they get out of balance, you become left hemisphere dominant. You start to get a lot of problems. You get a lot of control freakery, anxiety, literalism, black and white thinking, inability to take perspective because the left hemisphere doesn't take perspective. The left hemisphere knows, right? This is how it is. Now, of course, they're not working separately normally. Functionally, they're interacting and they can suppress each other to a certain degree. There's a lot of research around how they can suppress each other. But you can tell this if you're a musician, right? If you pick up a guitar, I used to do this all the time. I'd be fine playing, and then somebody would start like watching me. I'd go, "Oh, here comes a difficult bit. I better not screw this up." And then I couldn't play anymore, where it would seriously hinder my playing because I wasn't relaxed. Here's another difference. Left hemisphere does subject-object consciousness. Right hemisphere does participatory consciousness. So the left hemisphere does apart from, the right hemisphere does a part of. So like for something like performing music, you know this, you've got to be lost in the music. You've got to be in the music. You can't be apart from the instrument, apart from what you're playing and trying to play it whilst making sure you don't make any mistakes and all that. I mean, you can play like that, but it screws your playing up. But when you lose yourself in it, you become a part of it and you get into those flow states. So those kind of flow states, they're very typical of a kind of right hemisphere participatory consciousness versus that subject-object consciousness. So that's kind of interesting with change work, because sometimes you're working with like creating this distinction apart from, and sometimes you're dissolving that away and having people become a part of. I love the apart from, a part of distinction in change work. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of interesting stuff there. But basically what it did for me is have me go, I don't know shit about anything. I make up stuff all the time and think it's really true. And I'm always trying to control the world. And the other thing, once you start looking at that and recognizing that life and human life is a complex system, it's complex system dynamics. The left hemisphere can't handle complex system dynamics. It can only handle simplicity. So it renders everything that is complex simple. That's why everyone's got a political opinion about what should happen in order to fix all the world's problems. It's like, yeah, sure, it really is that simple. If we just did what you suggested, everything would be all right. Well, of course it won't, because it's a shit show and like it's relentless churning complexity. And there's no way of rendering that down to if we did this. And again, so if you take things like left hemisphere processing says, we want the 6 steps of the 6-step reframe. We just want to know the correct order to do the 6 steps in and know that it will come out. It's a very mechanistic way of thinking. Whereas the world doesn't work that way. So this is what Steve Charney used to call it the coffee machine model of the universe. That's sort of what the left hemisphere does. It's like, well, if we do the right things in the right order, then the right outcomes come about. And then it's like, oh, it didn't work. So McGilchrist's perspective is, in order to deal with complexity, particularly the complexity of modern life, we need to allow our right hemisphere to be the primary hemisphere and our left hemisphere to be the assistant. the useful assistant that can take certain things that can be simplified. But what we've ended up with is a culture that encourages us to be left hemisphere dominant, and the right hemisphere is often disregarded and thought to be unimportant. That's why if you can't argue your case, you have no case. Right? It's not enough to go, look, man, that's just my choice. It's like, no, you have to give a reason, because that's what the left hemisphere wants, reasons. So I find it kind of interesting. And again, like, I know there's so much more to learn from it, and there's so much I've forgotten from it. But it changed my life because I started to recognize how grabby the left hemisphere is, how much it wants to control the uncontrollable. And that's why it does a lot of anxiety, by the way, because it likes to be in control. And when it's not in control, it gets upset. Whereas the right hemisphere is like, what is that to control?
Well, how does this map across to your clients in change work sessions, thinking about knowing this about the right and left hemisphere?
I think that one of the big things that it actually reconnected me to is the value of maybe trance work, old school trance work stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because I certainly think the way Erickson did that, a lot of that is encouraging people to just fall out of that left hemisphere dominant thinking. The left hemisphere wants to do all the time. The right hemisphere is happy to participate and allow. So a lot of hypnotic phenomena just allow that hand to lift, and you can watch that happening now and just enjoy that. So I think there's something about falling out of that control freakery of the left hemisphere into a space of allowing, where when we do that, a lot of the problems that we had tend to disappear because they're problems of arguments with reality. A lot of people's problems are just a problem of an argument with reality. Reality isn't going the way I say it should, and therefore I'm getting upset about it. Well, if we can start allowing things and finding different ways to participate, different creative ways to participate, then life gets better. So, yeah, a lot of the time I'm looking for where is somebody caught up in a lot of left hemispherism and control freakery and all of that. And what do I want to do to take them into a more right hemisphere participatory sense? And I know that the right hemisphere is attending to nonverbals and responds a lot more to musicality and tempo and these sorts of things. So this is why one of the things I really like is when I got someone who's really caught in a left hemisphere zone, I just slow them down. I slow everything down. Because they can't, the left hemisphere needs to work like a flick book. If it doesn't flick at the right speed, the thoughts don't connect up right. And they just fall away and become incoherent. The person tends to fall into a different way of engaging. So much of the time, you can just really slow people down. Sometimes I might do that explicitly and say to a client, how would it be right now if you were to do this exact same thing you've been doing, but twice as slowly? And it's interesting when you do that, people go, do your problem, but twice as slowly. Do your problem thinking, but twice as slowly. And how is that different? And it changes everything. But much of the time, I'm just thinking about changing the vibe, slowing things down, and paying attention to sort of qualitative elements, which is, again, there's another distinction, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. Left hemisphere, quantitative. Right hemisphere, qualitative. So a lot of people are not paying attention to the qualitative elements of their experience or whatever. They're quantifying everything and they're trying to work out what's right and what's wrong. Is this like this or is that like that? And it's like they're not in the quality of everything. So a sort of qualitative shift, I think, is really, really useful. And partly some of those feedback loop questions, so what are you noticing now? It's not a quantitative, like how many things are you noticing? It's like what? What is it that's happening right now? So I like to kind of get a shift in the vibe and really attend to the vibe and the feel of what's unfolding in sessions. So as it's not all about just, if I do the right logical things, then the right outcome's going to come about, because maybe it will, maybe it won't. So I think that's partly how it influences me. And I want to see much more of that right hemisphere activation. So again, like a lot of processes, hypnotic processes are really good at getting people out of their logical mind. And if they've been in the grip of, that's part of what's been keeping their problem in place, most likely.
Well, I always like to thought experiment. Is there a reason in change work that you would ever want to purposely put them in the left hemisphere?
Yeah, there is. Absolutely. It's all good to go, so, oh, right, I get it. So the left hemisphere is bad, right? And the right hemisphere is good. No, 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 no. Chronic left hemispherism can be a bad thing. And chronic right hemispherism could also be a bad thing too. So, like I said, that the left hemisphere activation tends to be correlated with anxiety and euphoria. And the right hemisphere can have a much more of a sort of sense of reverence and mysticism, but it also has a higher level of activation in depression. It doesn't mean right hemisphere equals you'll be depressed all the time. It's just like the shadow side of the right hemisphere is depression. The shadow side of the left hemisphere is anxiety. So you've got these kind of things going on. Now, like think about this idea of subject-object consciousness versus participatory consciousness. It's wonderful to participate in, to be a part of something wonderful and glorious and peaceful and generative and all of this. But it's quite something else to be participating in and a part of a horror that is unfolding. That's not so good.
Right.
So it might be the case that you want somebody to be less embodied for a moment so they can have some space and they can do some thinking apart from something that wants to unfold. So again, it's like sometimes it's about patterns of chronicity. Like, is this client, are there patterns of chronicity, sort of very right hemispheric patterns of chronicity? In which case, the left hemisphere could be helpful here. Right? Or are there patterns of chronicity, quite left hemisphere patterns of chronicity, in which case a bit of right hemisphere activation could be what's helpful here.
I see.
You know?
So you mentioned earlier one way to start getting them towards the right hemisphere would be to slow them down. So what are some other maneuvers for either?
So I think a lot of it's vibe, and there are kind of non-verbal elements. So if I want somebody to get into a more kind of left hemisphere space, I might do something like, if I'm in the room with somebody and they start getting really lost in something, I might say to them, okay, stand up, take a step over here, and take a breath in, breathe out, and I give a series of instructions. Do this, do that, do this, do that, right? And I'll say, so as you step back from this and you just look at where you were in that chair there are some things that you can realize from here about that. Right? So, now listen to my tonality. So I've now gone into a very digital, very emotionless, computer-like sort of tonality.
Right.
Which is very different from that kind of one where you want to slow everything down and allow yourself to come into the body. Right? Whether you think of this as left, right, let's imagine you think of it as logical, rational, reasonable. If you wanted to caricature that, pantomime it, how would you do it? A lot of it can be done non-verbally. So I'll tend to do that kind of thing. Or even if you pattern interrupt, you go, I'm kind of curious. Right? So this kind of thing is a pantomime of, let's be reflective about this. So I'm going to literally like pantomime and evoke the attitude through my pantomime, through how I shift myself. So I want to be much more logical. Another thing you could do is you can go, there are certain things in your life that you're pretty good at thinking clearly about. Isn't that right? Now, that's probably true for most people. Even if they say, I don't know. You say, well, you don't have to know right now, but I know that sometimes you can figure out what you need to figure out. And they go, yeah. And I go, so what is it like when you're thinking very, very clearly? They're probably going to be free of a lot of heavy emotional baggage when they're doing that. They're probably going to be in a very left hemisphere kind of space. So I want to evoke that kind of style of thinking and relating. So knowing something of those styles of thinking and relating can help you go, well, if this is a yin yang and we've got this one that's dominant and we're stuck because of the dominance of this side, how can we evoke more of the other side? If you see what I mean. So I think that that's how that informs me. And just going back to that point earlier about implication versus application, that's never something I thought, I know how I'm going to apply this. I'm going to apply it like that. It's just the implication of suddenly being aware that, people do the world in these two really different ways. And it can be really useful to have some kind of balance and a useful generative interaction between these. So I suppose that's made its way into the background in the change work that I do, because it made its way into the background in how I look at life. And I'm seeing people being more left hemisphere, being more right hemisphere at different times. So that has become a part of my perceptual set, I suppose, to sort of filter in that way.
Well, we've talked a little bit about how having these understandings will help you in a change work session with your client. What about you as a practitioner in a session?
Well, the big change for me is before. I don't want to say that, there's before McGilchrist and after McGilchrist, but in a sense, for me, there is. McGilchrist blew my mind, frankly. I mean, literally blew my mind. And it was quite a difficult transition for a time, because I've been YouTubing for a long time and I've been teaching change work and all this. And I would rock up on these YouTube videos and really think that I knew what the heck I was talking about. I was really sure that I was right about a lot of things. Even though I was going, this is just a model, this is just a perspective. Deep down, my left hemisphere was quietly going, yeah, I think I got this nailed down. I know what's what.
Right.
So I had this big shift of like, I don't know anything. I just think I do, right? I've got no way of corroborating this stuff. It really rocked me for a time. And certainly with regard to my YouTube output and stuff like that, I had this, it just pattern interrupted me. I was having difficulty showing up on video and speaking like I knew what the heck I was talking about, when I was thinking, is this really true?
Right.
Is this really the case? So it threw me off kilter for a long time. Inside of client work sessions, one thing I started to realize is this diagnosis, command and control, programming, engineering kind of thing. That's really all left hemisphere stuff. So really, the recognition that I control nothing in the session was a big shift. That it wasn't really about me or the client, or that we were dealing with a much bigger, complex, emergent system that we could participate in. So this idea of a participatory consciousness versus a subject-object consciousness. I used to do change work from a subject-object place. I was outside of it. I was the operator running the procedure and all of this kind of thing. I was the engineer, the whatever it is. And it was about doing the right things and finding the right things and best practice and all of that stuff. In the end, look, nobody knows what's going to get the change. Nobody knows. The client doesn't know. I don't know. We're participating in something that's bigger than both of us. We're participating in the unfolding of life. Maybe there's magic to happen here and we don't know yet how it's going to happen. But we can show up with a sense of reverence and awe. These are very right hemisphere things. And we can be deeply and profoundly curious about what's possible, and we can playfully engage in an unfolding. And our left hemisphere can be in the mix as well. It can be there with its sense of intention and directionality. When this is dominant, then that becomes ignorance, ignoring everything else and driving through and grabbing for. But when it sits in the context of something broader, then it can just create a directionality and some dexterousness and a little bit of strategy and this kind of thing, because it's sitting within a broader, it's got a sense of humility that it's not controlling, but it does get to valuably contribute. So I think for me, there's bringing more of my whole self to it, being less needy to control the session. My personal levels of satisfaction and reward as a change work practitioner went up because the left hemisphere cares about doing it right and being correct. And there is a correct way and a right way. And it doesn't want anything to go wrong ever. The left hemisphere doesn't like things going wrong. It's not flexible about that. Hence the anxiety thing is my theory on it. So I used to not enjoy, I used to have a slight level of concern or trepidation that I might not be able to help the client, that I might not do the right thing, that I, listen to the I's, I might not, I. It's that thing, the self-imposed responsibility for success and failure is a heavy yoke indeed. The left hemisphere thinks that it is apart from the world and it must manipulate the world, and it will succeed or fail depending on its ability to manipulate and its set of understandings being correct. The right hemisphere's got no way of conceiving of things in that way. It's just a part of everything. It participates in. It's not its responsibility. There's no separation from what is unfolding. There is no being apart from it to control it. There is only being a part of it to participate in it. So for me, that's the really big shift in how I do change work. And it comes up in a lot of ways. If you get kind of very left hemispheric about it, there's all sorts of rules about how you should and shouldn't do change work. What's good coaching? What's bad coaching? What's correct? You're not really coaching. You're doing something else, right? All this right, wrong, should, shouldn't, is, isn't. That's all very left hemisphere. The worry about should I be doing this, should I be doing that? What does the protocol say? Is it evidence-based? All very left hemisphere stuff. I started to look at change work as being, okay, there's no rules to this anymore. Anything can come into the session. Anything can be a part of the session. And I can be open to some really wild ideas, and those ideas could be generative. So a lot of the time when I'm with a client, I act as if everything that's happened in my life over the previous few days or previous week or whatever happened for this moment for this client.
Oh, wow.
Right? So I used to have thoughts and ideas that would occur to me that would bubble up. But my old rules said, oh no, particularly being an ex-clean language guy. Oh, no.
Mm-hmm.
I can't impose my stuff in the mix. Well, that's a rule. You shouldn't do that. That's bad. That's dirty. That's not clean. Now I'm like, well, what if that thing happened that's occurring to me right now that seems relevant, happened because of this, to bring into this moment? If I don't bring it in, I never get to know. Right? So I'm going to bring this thing in. So I was talking to a client the other day. My dog has had this problem with his cruciate ligament and maybe needed to get surgery and all of this. So, people talk about Ericksonian metaphors, changework metaphors. Well, you don't need to make them up or use Erickson's metaphors because you have a life and things are happening all the time and they can have a variety of different meanings. They can be used as a vehicle for several different meanings. So I was talking to this client and I'd identified like a bind pattern. And I thought, I'm going to tell a story to get out of this. And my dog occurred. I said, my dog's got a problem with his knee at the moment. And she went, oh, God, you're not comparing me to your dog, are you? And I said, well, you should be flattered. I hold my dog in very high esteem. Right? And it was a moment, and it was a fun moment. And, you could go, well, is there a value to that? Well, there's a value in terms of rapport, the way we're dancing together. So that material comes in, that becomes a part of the dance. It becomes a part of the unfolding. I'm not here going, and then suddenly everything changed, and that was the intervention. But I used to sort of hold back and go, is that okay to bring that in? Is it because it's not really part of my repertoire? It's part of my life. It's not part of my evidence-based practice. It's part of my life. So I just kind of break the rules with that and bring anything into the moment. And I used to have this thing like, I don't know, I had some kind of personal injunction. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't bring that thing in. That thing that you only just discovered yesterday. Why is that thing you only discovered yesterday the thing you want to talk to your client about now? Is it because it's just interesting for you because you just discovered it? Now, all of that worry, that's all left hemisphere worry. Whereas if I go, okay, I learned this thing yesterday. It's what's come up right now. I'm going to bring it into the flow. Now, as long as I bring it in with a sense of let's see what this creates and let's steer what it creates in a useful direction, it doesn't matter what I bring in.
Yeah. Is there anyone else who's done work on the hemispheres that you've gotten out of, aside from that book?
No, not hugely. I mean, McGilchrist is the big beast in that area, but I will say Jill Bolte Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
So you could either read her book, which I can't, it might have the same name as her TED Talk. Her TED Talk is called My Stroke of Insight. Have you ever seen this, Jill Bolte Taylor's?
No.
She was a neuroscientist who had a stroke. She had a quite serious left hemisphere stroke. So she lost her left hemisphere function for a bit and went into this right hemisphere world and then had to rebuild that left hemisphere function. And was never the same again. But she talks about what it's like to go into this pure right hemisphere consciousness because she got to do it and got to be a neuroscientist who's going, wow, I now get to learn something from the inside about what happens here.
Oh, wow.
But so much of what she describes fits in with what McGilchrist is talking about. And if you look at things like spiritual experiences and loss of the ego and off that, this is basically what she's talking about. She said one of the really big problems when she started having this stroke. She was trying to get help, but the I that wanted to get help was falling apart and disappearing. And a different consciousness was emerging, which was one of being in a profound sense of oneness and unity with all things, which was great. And it was so great, so freeing and so wonderful. And one of the things she talks about is during her rehab, she's a changed person forever, and not because of the brain damage necessarily, but because of seeing the world and being in the world in such a different way. She was like, in a sense, aware of the functionality of building back a lot of that left hemisphere way of doing things. But at the same time, it just didn't feel as good as the right hemisphere way of being.
Wow.
Inside of things for her. But it's very interesting. So her account was, there's nothing in that contradicts McGilchrist's perspective. But you're getting from her that first person journey from a left hemisphere dominated world to a right hemisphere dominant world or ascendant world, and then rebuilding that left hemisphere function again and finding a different way of living that balances the two. So that's a really good thing. And you can check out a lot from her TED talk. Her book is also on Audible. So if you're an audiobook fan, which I know you are.
Yeah. I'm going to check those out. I think this is incredibly useful stuff. Is there anything else you would want to say?
There's a podcast. Back then, I did those trance inductions simply because people wanted them. People wanted to learn trance inductions. I was really the hypnosis without trance guy. What do you want to do that induction for? Waste of time. No such thing as trance. Just go straight for the phenomena you want, shape it up.
Right.
Okay, there's absolute validity and utility to that concept. And I still hold, there is no special state called trance that renders people uniquely suggestible in a way they wouldn't otherwise have been. And if there was a state that did that, it would be called trust and not trance. Right? That's what I always used to say at the time. So this whole trance thing, I just saw it as window dressing at best, a bit of ritual, whatever. But having had my post-McGilchrist shift, I started to look at what Erickson was doing and see it very, very differently, and see that what he called therapeutic trance, which he didn't do to get people more suggestible or anything like that. His mentor, Clark Hull, the guy he learned hypnosis from. He was all about that. Hypnosis, if it's anything, is a state that increases suggestibility. That's not how Erickson worked at all, I don't believe. So I started to come back and appreciate what Erickson was doing as a profoundly kind of right hemispheric thing. It's almost like, let's take a holiday in the right hemisphere. Let's let your conscious mind, your left hemisphere, drift away, and let's really connect into this state which has incredible value, incredible utility, has an entirely different way of seeing the world and being in the world, and has much to offer much of the time. So I started to kind of reconnect with this and really, really value it as a state in and of itself. And so that's kind of brought me back around. And I really like doing sort of right hemisphere trance work. I think it's of incredible value. And then actually what I love doing now is much more that immersive trance work stuff and seeing what unfolds from it. And if I look back at my hypnosis with that trance stuff, again, I'm not doing it down. It's valuable. It's got great utility. It works. People have learned a lot of good stuff from it. It's a way of thinking about things. But man, is it a left hemisphere dominant approach to hypnosis. It's all about, right, what do we want? We want to get that. How do we strategically get there? Let's cut all the window dressing away. Let's cut through, and it's valuing only the outcome. It's really kind of like, right, we're making this thing happen. And so to me, and I know a lot of people would look at that and go, James, I don't see that in it, because a lot of people have said that it's an approach that seems to be much more in the moment than chasing the outcome. But to me, compared to how I work now, it seems to be very much chasing the outcome.
So there you go. I hope you found that as interesting as I did. If you'd like to get in touch, you can reach us here at changeworkingpod@gmail.com. Give us your thoughts, any feedback, and ideas for topics. And if you have any questions, we'll try to answer those on a future episode. See you next time.
Changeworking is produced by Ruckus Sky. For information on training, go to clientshifts.com.